I've got another 42-inch cut 100 series John Deere deck. This is the popular mowers sold at Home Depot, the John Deere mowers that Lowe's and some of the big box stores sell. It's got some of the regular problems that I see all the time from these. The spindle has already broke loose from the deck once, and they put some big washers on it to try to hold it back on there, but it's just starting to crack out even more. And the guy said this thing actually cocked sideways and they had to pry it back up with a pry bar. So I don't know exactly what I'm going to find when I take off all these bolts and get that pulley off of there. Sure, it's not going to be good. Then the hangers are starting to come loose again. It looks like they've already been welded once. This one's been over to the side quite a bit. It should be in line with that square. And this one's pulled up as well. And it's not straight either. It'll have to be leaned over a little bit and then welded back down to the deck. This spindle has already been, it looks like it came loose from the deck, and they actually cut a piece of steel and put in there that's not factory. So this deck's already had some pretty extensive work done on it. The piece that connects the front of the deck to the back of the deck is missing, and the blades have obviously been getting into the front of the deck here, so I'm going to put a patch over that and run a piece of round bar around to reinforce the deck. One of the problems these tractors always have has already been worked on. It looks like they've reinforced that, and it's holding because that pulley's still straight like it's supposed to be. So that's one thing I won't have to work on, but there's plenty of other stuff on this one. I'll get it apart and show you some photos of what it looks like after the parts are off, see how bad the damage really is. I got a little further down and wanted to take a quick video before I pull the spindle completely off. But it does have some pretty serious cracks. This stuff should have been welded up before they ever put the spindle back on it, because it's only going to get worse. So there's some cracks running out a good 5 inches away from the mandrel on every bolt hole. Luckily all the pieces of metal are still there, so I can weld them back up. You don't have to fabricate any pieces for this deck. I also found something pretty interesting. Instead of welding this piece here back on when it broke off like they usually do, they cut this piece off of the mower and they welded it from the back side, and then they welded the bracket back to the mower, which is very sloppy. There's plenty of room on these to weld around the perimeter on the top side. The pulley won't come down that far, and you get a stronger weld because the perimeter of the top side is much larger diameter than the bottom, and it'll hold and stay. That's how they should have probably been welded from the factory. So if you run into this problem with that idler falling off, just weld it from the top side. But I'll go ahead and pull the spindle and we will look at the cracks a little closer. I've got the pulley off now, and we can see all the damage. There is one piece missing, and there usually is at least one piece missing when they are damaged this bad. You've got some pretty serious cracking there. Another one running up on this side quite a ways. This one's got some cracking as well, but still holding together. And that one's got some minor cracking. All the holes are wobbled out where the spindle had come loose and vibrated on the deck for quite a while. Very common on these tractors. It'd be a great idea to check them, but you wouldn't be looking for these videos if you checked them and avoided this problem. Nobody would think that that is going to come loose like that. But what I'll do is put this pulley back on and put the washers back on when I hammer them flat, because they're all bent up right now and they're not straight. But these are some good washers with the right size diameter hole for the bolts, so I'll go ahead and reuse these. But I'll hammer them flat and I'll put them back on the deck here, and then I'll get the spindle mounted and I'll tack weld these in place so that all the holes line up the way I want them to, and I'll actually mount this spindle back to the existing holes the way it was sitting before. You can clock these 1/8 of a turn and drill new holes, but once I weld it up, it'll be strong. Here's the view from the bottom side. Some of these cracks. I've already started welding on that one. I just straighten them up one at a time, get them in line, and run a weld down them. Do it from both sides. That one runs back quite a ways. I had to do something a little different with this one. I had the bigger washers to work with than I normally use. I did find the reason I think they were bent before was because they're so big they're actually hitting the aluminum spindle where it comes up through the hole in the middle of the deck. So I bent them just a hair up so they won't interfere with the spindle as it comes up. I got it for far enough up to where there's a air gap and it's not touching the aluminum, right on the lip where the aluminum comes through the deck. And then on the two over here by the hump, I ground the back off so they don't interfere with where the deck arches up. And I'm gonna go ahead and weld these down and then sew up all the cracks after I weld the washers down. And I had to snug the bolts up just to get the washers exactly where I wanted them, because once I weld them, then I can tighten them down all the way without having to worry about the washers turning when I torque the bolts. Okay, I've finished welding the washers on. I went ahead and took the pulley off so I wouldn't get it too hot. I just used it to get the washers in place and get them tacked down, and then I took the pulley out of the way. I've welded up the remaining cracks I could find leading away from the holes, and then I cleaned it up and get ready to put the pulley back on. Now I've started straightening out the hangers on the back. I didn't video all that on this time because it's just a lot of beating, and anybody can swing a hammer. Just got to get these things straight and kind of beat them back until the welds close up and you can see where it was supposed to be, but you can tell from the square that it's standing up straight now. It's not tilted over sideways anymore. I hammered this one back down so it closed that gap that used to be right there. I'm going to cut me some triangles and weld those on to reinforce it, and then hit all the spots that are connected to the deck and put some extra weld on for strength. I went ahead and welded this thing up on the outside of this side just to add a little extra strength on it, and I'm going to weld around that bolt for the pulley to slide down onto, make sure it doesn't break off again. Okay, I've cut my pieces of angle, tie into the front of the bracket and give it a lot more support on the deck. I've hammered this one about as good as I'm going to get it. I'm just going to weld up the remaining cracks. Everything's straight and square now. I've got it positioned a little off to one side to be out of the way of where they've done the work on this pulley and changed all this metal down here. It's not all flush. I wanted that thing to have good flush metal to weld to. Okay, I'm gonna start repairing this side over here where the piece is missing. This is real common on these John Deere decks. Right here is where the deck stops, and they've got some kind of another piece that's welded in here, and every one of them's got a broken weld right there. I don't know if you call it a broken weld or just, I don't know if they're even welded. Here's one that's still together. And you can kind of see there it actually isn't a weld holding that together there. So I guess that's factory. Now I'm going to repair the side over here where a piece is supposed to be connecting the front and back of the deck. This piece is missing, therefore the front of the deck has been pushed into the blades, and the blades have started destroying the front of the deck. I found this extra baffle that was on a tractor that I was working on for a friend, and I put all new baffles under it because all but this one was damaged, but this one's a little bit scratched up on the bottom, but it still works great to give me the angle of bend I need to keep my blades away from the part I'm going to make. I'm going to bend a piece of round bar and weld it down to the top of that baffle and use that baffle as a kind of like a diagram of where I want my round bar to be. Here's my piece of round bar. A friend of mine gave me several of these pieces already cut to length, and I've been using them for this exact purpose. Working out great. Thank you, Dax. I'll be back as soon as I bend my round bar. I just stick it in the vise and either use a hammer to make slow changes to the shape of it, or bend it by hand. I've got what works out real great. I've got a real heavy duty little table over here. I use this table here that my grandfather built, and I just stick my bar in it and I stick it in about 1 inch at a time and pry on it and just start getting a bend on it until it fits the shape of my deck. You can see here where I've marked it. That's a piece that's actually hanging down a little too far after I straightened it out, so I marked it with a grinder. I'm going to cut that off so it doesn't interfere with my baffle. I'm going to stick that baffle in there and weld it in place. It'll give me the right roundness on the outside of here to stay away from the blades. This side here had the same thing. That's where the deck actually came down and welded to the original piece that is missing. And I'm going to cut both of those off so that when I wrap my round bar around on top of this piece of baffle, that nothing will get in the way of it, and it can sit flush and be welded down. Cleaned up so that baffle can fit in there. I squared up the edges there. I just used my grinder to cut a little trench in the baffle, and then I bend it. Saves a lot of grinding. Checking the fit on it. Looks like I need to take a little bit off the front edge there so it'll square up, but looking pretty good. Alright, I got my piece of baffle cut to fit. I'll have to hold it up and tack it in place there. And then I've got my piece of round bar shaped. And it worked out perfect where that piece of round bar overlaps onto the deck, so it'll tie it in even better and stronger. And the blade is a good inch away from the rod, so nothing will hit. Okay, I've welded my baffle down, and then I've adjusted this piece of metal here so that it's flush against my round bar. That way I can get a good weld on that, and then it lines up close to the deck and it sits flush against that baffle, so I can weld it as it comes around that baffle. And I've got this backside hammered out to where it is pretty close to that round bar as well, so I can get a good weld on the front and back to tie it all together real tight. Alright, I've finished welding. I've got the back end all welded up. I went ahead and welded all the way around the baffle to weld that round bar down to the baffle, and then also welded the bottom side and the top side everywhere that it met with metal, so this thing's pretty strong. And I'm probably going to go ahead and patch over those holes there as well. Just haven't done that yet. I've decided to go ahead and put bolts with nuts on the back side rather than these self-tappers. These self-tappers have a tendency to back out. I'm going to go ahead and make this where it'll hold up for the guy. I don't want it coming back. I've got to drill these out to get my bolts to fit in. The aluminum holes are a little bit smaller than my bolts. Just do one at a time that way. Alright, I pulled the self-tappers out here, and I went back with the long bolts with nuts on the back side, so probably even put a tack weld on those threads on the back side of those nuts so these can't loosen up. I threw an extra washer on top and one on the bottom just for extra support. See, the threads come through quite a ways. I'll cut those off and weld the bolt to the nut so the nuts can't come loose. And those washers gave it some nice support so it won't crack the aluminum, or at least maybe help it from cracking the aluminum. I cut the bolts off and welded the nut to the bottom of the bolt so the nuts can't back out. I found a piece of steel to cut that'll fit over these holes in the deck. Just gotta trim it to fit. Cut the patch out to cover up the holes. Okay, I'm finally finished welding on this one. I've got my patch on now. No more hole in the deck. I welded all the way around it, so it's very strong. Use my piece of baffle to weld around, use to put my round bar on and strengthen the deck so the front end won't cave into the blades anymore. I've taken the idler, or this would be the tensioner pulley, off and greased it with a grease needle. You can see the grease coming out of it now. And then I replaced the idler pulley because it was wobbling quite a bit. The bearing was going bad in it. Those were only 13 bucks on Amazon. And then all my welding's done on this. The little plastic covers are missing that showed the pulleys, so I welded some little pieces of bar on there to keep the belt from falling off whenever you slack the belt and the belt's whipping around. The belt will come off. I left just enough room to where you can actually pull the belt off if you need to by hand. And there's my little pieces of triangle I welded on. I actually cut those off of a old lawnmower blade that was wore out, so I try to reuse some of the scrap that I come across. And this was the one that was real bad. I braced the back side and the front side there to keep it from pulling loose again. I welded up a couple of holes over here. Put another rod to keep this belt from falling off this pulley. Welded up some holes that the last guy left, and that's all done now. Throw the grass deflector back on it and start on my next one.